Good morning. It's time for today's special hour-long AM Minnesota with Jerry's top 5 ag story picks for 2016. And my top story again this year is the weather. Tom Halverstedt is a scientist at the Southern Research and Outreach Center at Waseca. And Tom, Gordy, our news director, was telling me, Jerry, you pick the weather as your top story, it seems, every year. Well, thinking about it, going back to 13, 14, 15, and 16, I think it was my top pick, and justifiably so.
I think I agree with you. 2013, I remember, we had a terrible spring that year. That was the year of prevented planting. People couldn't get in to get their work done. 2014 followed that up. That was another late spring, wet spring, and an early fall that year, so we kind of had a short growing season. This year, the big story is rain. We set a state record here at Waseca, and generally the area probably wouldn't measure up, and maybe a few isolated spots could have had even more, but as far as National Weather Service reporting stations, which we are one, there's 175 across the state. We're over 55 inches of rain for the year now. The previous record was 53.5 inches. So we have a state record, and that is about 20,000 annual observations going back to the 1880s. No one's measured that much rain in a year, so astounding for us.
And the average, if I remember correctly, 35.7?
Our average is 35.7. We're going to get about 20 inches more than that, 2 feet extra water, lots of ways to look at it. We had over an inch of rain a week for the entire year. So, lots of rain.
And warm, too.
We were very warm. This is likely to be our second warmest year on record. Our warmest year goes back to 1931, and I was looking at the figures thinking, we're here in December now, and the figures aren't in, but the first 11 months of this year were all warmer than normal. And I started thinking, wow, we could maybe have the warmest year ever. But I went back to the records for 1931. They had an incredibly warm winter that year, lots of 50-degree temperatures, and January and February. Must have been no snow cover. I wasn't around in 1931, but we don't stand a chance of being the warmest year, but we could be in the second warmest year. We're going to average in the neighborhood of 3.5 degrees warmer than normal.
When I think about it, Tom, that incredible amount of moisture, it's amazing that we set a state record for yield. Now, granted, my farm just 25 miles to the south. You guys picked up a couple really heavy rains that didn't even get 25 miles south, but still, state of Minnesota, record corn and soybean yields.
That is true, and we had lots of rain, but we did it in really what I would say is the only way you could do it and get a crop. We had heavy rain in July, August, and September. My rule of thumb is our July rainfall was about double normal, August about triple, and September about 4 times our normal rainfall for those 3 months. Up until then, we weren't above normal in precip. It was all those 3 months that really added to our yearly total. Had all that rain come in April, May, and June when we're trying to do things like plant or the crop is small and it can be easily covered up, would have been a lot worse for crop development and growth, and we probably wouldn't have had nearly as good a yield. It came at a time when the crop can take a lot of water, it can stand up above a lot of water, and it uses a lot of water. Plus, a lot of that rain came so hard, so fast, a lot of it ran off into streams and lakes and rivers, and as far as crop damage-wise, it was really the only way we could do it.
You mentioned the key. Corn, soybeans can't stand completely submerged in water for more than a couple, 3 days, depending on water temperature. But you have a lot more time that it could be standing in water as long as it's sticking out above and still produce a crop in that pothole or area that's submerged.
Yeah, when soybeans, July, when we started getting these heavy rains, soybeans were easily a couple, 3 feet tall. Corn well up over your shoulders. there could be 2 feet of standing water in there, and the crop made it through that. The other thing that, we had a fine planting season, and we had a decent harvest season. That still a little muddy out there, but we were able to at least get through. You could go in a lot of fields and see some deep tracks where somebody was harvesting soybeans. All of a sudden, there's deep ruts where they stopped, backed out, and maybe came back to some of those spots. And a very few spots they never did get to harvest.
Well, Tom, if you can stand by, we have to take a quick break for the markets.
Okay.
Welcome back to today's special hour-long AM Minnesota program, Jerry's Top 5 Ag Stories for 2016. Talking with Tom Halverstead, who's a scientist at the Southern Research and Outreach Center at Waseca, about my top story. Once again, the weather this year. Just summing up what we talked about before the break, Tom, the Southern Research and Outreach Center at Waseca set an yearly annual precipitation record, and we came close to setting a temperature record, but we didn't get it because, what was it, back in 1931, December was very warm?
It was the winter months, December of that year, and January, February. Of course, those don't comprise the same winter, but just a lot of January, February, and December of that year were all in the neighborhood of 10 degrees warmer than normal. My thinking is probably lack of snow cover that year.
But in 2016, then, we had 11 months in a row above normal temperature. 11
consecutive months. Jury's still out on December. It may be our 12th consecutive month, and we're going to come in. I think our annual temperature average is about 45 degrees. I think we're going to come in 48.7 or 48.8. Would be one of our warmest years, but it's the rainfall that really is the story this year, and that's been a pattern. That has been the one very consistent pattern we've seen over the course of the last 50 years is we're getting more rain than we used to. Our average rainfall for a year since about 1950 has steadily gone up about 7 inches. And the climatology people update their normals every 10 years, so we are now calling normal our observations from 1981 to 2000, those 30 years. The next time we update that will include this decade we're in, and we had a lot of rain last year, a lot of rain this year. Some things I'm seeing is really a pattern. I've looked at our growing season rainfall, and our average is 21.5 inches in the growing season. We never saw 30 inches of rain in a growing season. Our records go back to 1915, long ways back. We never saw a 30-inch rainfall growing season, which is May through September. Since 1991, 25 years ago, now it's happened 6 times. Never happened for 75 years. Now it's happened 6 times. So there is definitely a trend that we are getting more rain. And as I listen to some of the climate experts like Mark Seeley with the university talk about climate change, he said one thing that is very consistent is more moisture in the atmosphere at the mid-latitudes. And that's where we are. We're halfway from the equator to the pole, and that's where we're seeing more moisture, and that's been a worldwide phenomenon.
A topic for a whole number discussion is climate change or global warming and man-made carbon dioxide. But I read a article once that seemed logical to me that we're growing a lot more corn and we're irrigating corn, and that corn is putting, evapotranspiration and it's putting moisture up into the air. Maybe there's more moisture than in the air for the atmosphere to work with, and maybe that's why we're getting more rainfall. My limited scientific mind, that kind of seemed logical, but who knows? I think the jury is really still out on causes and what to do about it, and if it's bad or good or in between.
Yeah, I'm neither qualified nor capable to really address that topic, but certainly they can measure the evapotranspiration off a corn crop compared to native grass or a pasture type situation. And I think more water does evaporate off corn, but we grew a lot of corn in the 1950s, and whether all this stuff is a natural cycle or something that we're doing influences it, that's going to have to be addressed by a lot more scientific stuff than we're capable of in our little labs here.
And then the other thing I thought of, carbon dioxide, they seem to be pointing their fingers at is bad and causing, quote, global warming. But all of those acres of corn and all that mass we grow now, the plants themselves, all that plant material, that's all using carbon dioxide, actually taking it out of the air and putting it back in the soil right through the plant. So you think that may be but I don't know what to think anymore.
Well, yeah, the carbon balance is something that a lot of people are studying and looking at. That's a whole other issue. But as far as what we can do, a couple things that we need to think about. We're seeing more of these heavy rains, and it seems as though the bigger percentage of our rain is coming in these big storm events where we're getting 3-4 inch rains at a time. We used to think of a 2.5 inch rain as once a year. It seems like every year we're getting 2 or 3 of those events. We also set this year our record, our biggest 24-hour rainfall event, 7.64 inches. Broke our old record by over 2 inches. So for farmers on right in our landscape, I think the things to take from that is the distribution of our rainfall probably isn't going to be entirely convenient for everyone. When we do get more of these rains, sometimes there's going to be the haves and the have-nots. We may see these storms hit one county, miss another county. Doesn't mean we have to always plan on more rain, but we're going to have to probably manage for a poorer rainfall distribution and try to plan our crops around that.
And I think the other key, Tom, is then to do a good job leaving residue, managing residue, building waterways or sediment basins, something so when these heavy rains do come, you don't lose a lot of your topsoil.
That is a key investment that all farmers are concerned about. That's their livelihood. They don't want to see it wash down the river. So absolutely, people need to consider we're getting more of these big rains, and we certainly don't want to see water erosion increase any more than we're already dealing with.
Before I let you go, Tom, one more quick question. What's your projection on the upcoming growing season? Now, granted, soils were saturated when they froze up, but tile should have still been running, so it doesn't necessarily mean we're set up for a cold, wet spring, does it?
No, I don't think so. I think, certainly we've got plenty of soil moisture. I think we're in actually a pretty good situation. We've had a little bit of cold weather, but we got some decent snow cover that looks like it probably will have snow cover most of the winter. I think if we get nice conditions in the spring, like we had last year, things went early, and we had a great spring. I would hope for the same this year. We need to not look at some of those way above normal precipitation events in March and April. If we're going to have a drought, that's a good time to have it during the late spring or late winter and early spring. I like to see dry conditions at that time of year.
Thanks, Tom. Always enjoy talking with you.
All right. Thank you, Jerry.
Tom Halverstedt, scientist at the Southern Research and Outreach Center at Waseca. My second pick for the top 5 ag stories of 2016, well, it had to be record corn and soybean yields, even with the extreme weather that we had. Rolled with that, almost record losses for livestock producers. Ken Tisi's an ag analyst with Minstar Bank over there in Lake Crystal. And Kent, I think that's pretty safe to say. A lot of us are wondering, how did we pull off those incredible corn and soybean yields given all of the rain that we had this last summer, especially later on in the summer and fall?
Yeah, it was an amazing year. It's kind of one of those years, as we look back, we started out, especially in western, south central Minnesota and southwest Minnesota, northwest Iowa, with delayed planting. Many farmers in that area struggling to get their corn in the ground by the end of May and their soybeans in by mid-June. And then, of course, over in the area where I'm from over here in south central Minnesota, we had a lot of rain, eastern Blue Earth County, parts of Watonwan, Martin County, in mid-June with some drown-out damage, and that did hurt yields definitely. And then we had the record rainfall in the Waseca, Owatonna areas south of Mankato in September. So amazing year. You look at many areas had record rainfall, but what everybody kind of forgot about is the long growing season we had that offset that. You know, it was I think at the outreach center at Waseca, they had record rainfall, but they also had the second longest growing season. The only growing season that was longer was 1988, the drought year, and the record heat. And they had over 2,900 growing degree units, and the first killing frost in most areas didn't happen until well into October. So we had the moisture, and we didn't get the extreme heat to get those growing degree units. It was just kind of generally warmer through the entire growing season, which is much better. If you get extreme heat, then you kind of cut into yield. So it was kind of the best of all worlds. Now, as we say that, certainly there's some areas over in our area here that where farmers weren't quite as fortunate. They lost some acres. Fortunately, what they had left was very good yields, so they still ended up with average to above average yields, but not probably the record yields. Some areas had actually better yields a year ago than this year, but many areas, especially western Minnesota, up into North Dakota, down into parts of Iowa and southeast Minnesota, had the best yields they've ever had, corn and soybeans.
You suffered with a little more moisture over in the Lake Crystal area. You mentioned Waseca, but then my farm in very south central Minnesota, southeastern Minnesota, and even a lot of Faribault and East, you mentioned the best corn and soybean crop we ever had. Unless you got hit by one of those stray thunderstorms with some hail or a lot of green snap, because we saw some of that too, and that was really tough. Your neighbor a mile down the road had tremendous crops, and you suffered a lot of green snap, and you kind of had a whole hum yield. But still, overall, the state of Minnesota, didn't we set a record yield for corn and soybeans this year?
Yeah, Minnesota, the projection by the National Ag Statistics Service is a statewide yield of 190 bushels an acre. And you think about that, with Minnesota running from Roseau and International Falls down to our area here, to have that kind of average yield is pretty phenomenal. And that's a new record yield. And last year we set a record yield at 188. And you know, if you go back, you don't have to go back that far. We had a statewide yield of 156 in 2014 and 160 in 2013, and the same in Iowa. They're projected to have a record yield this year at 199, and the previous record was 192 a year ago. And same thing in soybeans. Minnesota projected to have a record yield at 52, and that broke our record of 50 from last year. And we were only at 41 bushels an acre in 2014, and Iowa's projected to have a record yield of 59 bushels on soybeans and broke last year's record of 56.5. And I don't know historically how far you'd have to go back for the states of both Minnesota and Iowa to have record yields of both corn and soybeans 2 years in a row. You know, some years you'll get a record corn yield, but the soybeans are down, or vice versa. But to have both crops set records 2 years in a row, I guess you'd have to go back many, many years to where that's happened. So it's pretty unusual kind of situation we've had here in northern parts of the Corn Belt. And on top of that, nationally, of course, we got record production. States of Illinois has a record yield of 202, and that compares to only 175 in 2015, and Indiana at 177. So some pretty phenomenal yields in many areas of the primary growing areas of the Corn Belt.
And then going over to the other side, who uses a lot of that corn and soybeans is livestock. I don't know if they set record losses, but it was really tough to be a livestock producer, whether it was cattle or hogs or dairy. It was just a tough 2016.
It has been, really throughout the whole year. the profit margins, if they existed at all, have been pretty minimal. We'll start with our main industry, I guess, here in southern Minnesota, the hog industry. And throughout most of 2016 on finishing hogs, there's been an average loss of probably $30 to $40 a head. And that's varied. There was maybe a small profit window back in the summer when we had a little better prices, but that was pretty short-lived. And those losses have even been greater here as we got later in the year. Now, there's some hope. The prices, as we look out into 17, especially to the second and third quarter, start to improve. But, hog producers have faced either very low or negative profit margins for most of the last 18 months. So it's been a tough pull. And we switch over to the cattle side, and cattle feeding industry was really tough this year. I mean, many producers had losses of $100 to $300 a head or more, depending on when they were marketed in, and there just hasn't been many opportunities to lock in any profits in feeding cattle, and so it's, again, been tough. The good news has been the cost of production for both hogs and cattle have stayed relatively low compared to recent years because of the lower feed costs. We talked about the extra production for corn and soybeans has kept grain prices at more moderate levels, which has helped the feed costs, and the other costs have stayed pretty low, but certainly tough. And even the cow-calf producers, they saw their the cost of feeder cattle or prices they got for their feeder cattle dropped by about 40 to 50% from the start of the year till the end of the year. So the calves they're selling this fall are at the lowest level they've been in a few years. So just tight all over. And then we get over to the dairy side of things. And again, most producers probably need $18 a hundredweight on their milk to break even. And most of the year we were well below that, $2-3 below that. And the milk prices have come up here late in the year, but certainly at best, just getting back to maybe barely break even for a lot of dairy people.
Looking at going forward in the next crop and book closeout and running projected cash flows, it's one thing if you're raising corn and soybeans and you had great yields. My sense is that'll be okay, but boy, with low prices and then maybe a little substandard yield, or the livestock producers, you mentioned hog producers, 18 months of losses. This is going to be tough going forward for a lot of farmers, isn't it, Kent?
It is. What we're finding, and I've talked to some of the farm management folks as well, is coming out of last year, a lot of producers ended up better than projected. Just as you said, they're carrying probably more bushels on their inventory. Costs for livestock have been lower. And again, we talk about averages. There's always a lot of difference in there. In the case of livestock, the producers that do margin management and try to lock in things, maybe they showed losses, but they weren't quite as great, or maybe they were able to have a little profit at some point. So again, a lot of that comes into that. And the same with crop production. Marketing is we've talked about the production side. I just had one of my producers in yesterday, and he's been hauling in corn for 2 weeks, delivering it corn that he sold between $3.60 and $3.80 a bushel earlier in the years. That makes the bottom line look a lot better than selling it at $3.10 or $3.20 that you can probably get right now if you're lucky. So it definitely, that marketing part makes a difference. But I think as we look forward, one of the challenges is some producers been getting 60 bushel an acre soybeans and over 200 bushel an acre corn, and all of a sudden, if we got to go back to maybe what's more typical yields, 180 to 185 on corn and maybe 50 to 55 on soybeans, it gets a little harder to make cash flows work at today's prices.
Egg analyst Kent TC. My third story in the top 5 egg stories for 2016, it had to be weeds. Weeds as in giant ragweed, water hemp, and a new one, Palmer Amaranth. Lisa Becken is a crop specialist down at the Rochester Regional Extension Office. Lisa, you and I over the last 2 or 3 years have talked a lot about 2 of those 3 weeds, and I think we're going to be talking a whole lot more about them in the near future.
We absolutely will, and you're right. Giant ragweed and water hemp have been 2 weeds that have gotten more difficult to control, and their territories as to where they're showing up and just the sheer density of how they are infesting fields is certainly becoming a bigger problem. Farmers do need to rethink strategies of how they will manage these weeds. They need to come up with plans that are not just a one-year plan, but multiple-year plans, and how they can incorporate this into the rotation of their crops. So it's become, as we say, it's not simple anymore. It's not easy. We need to be strategizing as to how we can lay out some plans to control these weeds, because they do take yield, they do cause problems, and they will continue to cause problems if we don't get ahead of the game.
The issue to me, Lisa, really started in 2013. I didn't worry too much about controlling weeds till then. Well, that was a prevented plant year, and we wanted to get our herbicides on, and the weeds were getting way too big for the label, and we were trying to kill them. And maybe it was two things. Maybe they call water hemp because it likes a lot of rain.
That's right.
But the other thing is, they were getting too big because of the weather. But in my mind, that's when things really started to be a struggle, starting with 2013, the prevented plant year. And 14 was really wet in the spring, early summer, too.
Well, it did cause a great problem because, as you know, a number of acres never did get planted. People were trying to manage, because if you don't plant the crop, the weeds are going to be an issue, and the weeds did come through, but we couldn't plant because it was so wet. That also meant that we couldn't manage the weeds early and try and take care of them. Many of them got very big. They did go to seed. It was just a difficult, challenging time to manage those weeds, and of course, they got big enough to set seed and to build up that seed bank that becomes so problematic. Now we're having to come back and clean those up. So in areas you maybe had things under control, but 2013 set you up for additional weed seed that now we're trying to manage, and we will continue to manage.
Tom Halverston had a great comment here a couple of years ago, and he said, when we first had glyphosate, farmers got a kick out of it. You could let all those weeds come, and you could go out there and you could just smoke them, and they'd all die. And it was like, well, I only got to make one pass, so what if they get bigger? I can kill them. Well, we're going to have a mindset change now, back to the olden days before we had glyphosate, even though we have it now. Get those darn weeds when they're small.
That is a common theme that actually Fritz and I have been talking about, and my other counterparts that work with weed science. We have been talking about, the pre-post systems and having to manage those weeds small actually for quite a few years, because looking ahead, you could kind of foresee what was going to happen in some of the problems. You are right. Glyphosate was a very good, and it still has a place in our systems as far as controlling weeds. But the problems that are really growing is that we have resistance problems. And it didn't just start with glyphosate. We've had herbicide-resistant weeds going way back when we, primarily were using a lot of atrazine, the triazines. We had triazine-resistant weeds. Then you jump forward when we were using a lot of pursuit that controlled quite a few of our weeds, including water hemp at that time. We moved into an ALS-resistant time in the early 90s. We saw pursuit that wasn't working as well for us. Well, that was before glyphosate even hit the market. Move into the glyphosate era. We used glyphosate on many, many acres, as you know, across a lot of crops. And when we expose our weeds to the same material year after year, acre after acre, we will select for those populations that are resistant. And that's where we're moving into. The tough part, though, is, again, what we thought was really good and was at its point in time has led us to a problem where we're not controlling the weeds. We have more species that are showing up with resistance, and even more so having cross-resistance or multiple herbicide resistance. So we have giant ragweed that's not only resistant to glyphosate, but also resistant to ALS materials. We have water hemp that's resistant to ALS materials. It was also now resistant to glyphosate, and now starting in late 2015 into 16, confirmed resistance to PPO. So we have weeds that are, again, showing up at a greater area across the landscape. They are more difficult to control. We have resistance showing up, and now we have multiple resistance to, several herbicides. So the challenge is in front of farmers to do things differently and to put strategies together, and all of these strategies have to start with using an effective pre-emergence herbicide. So systems is going to be the game, and, it's going to take some time to think about.
Thinking about my past, Lisa, and where we've come and where we might be going, a phrase comes to mind, what goes around comes around. Mm-hmm. Back when I was younger, we cultivated twice, and we walked the beans. Well, then with all the herbicides, and especially with glyphosate, it allowed farmers to work a lot more acres.
Right.
And I'm wondering if these weed issues are now going to force farmers to scale back because it isn't as easy and simple as it used to be, and it's going to be harder to manage all those acres. Just a thought.
Well, it is a good thought, and it'll be interesting to see how we do shift, because part of the management strategies has to include non-chemical options. Well, what are the non-chemical options? It may be planting date. We know that giant ragweed is an early emerging weed. It starts early April, really goes through May, and in early June is kind of the end of its time. Well, with soybeans, one option would be to delay your planting of soybeans into the latter part of May and take out those first flushes of giant ragweed with tillage. Use tillage, so again, another non-chemical option, to take out those flushes of weeds, plant a little bit later, so change your planting date so you get ahead of the giant ragweed. Another option that we've been looking at with water hemp and some of our trials at Rochester is, again, systems. What can we do? Well, we need an effective pre-emergence product that goes down to control the weeds that we have, and then bring back that field cultivator. Coming back in with the cultivator, usually about the third week of June, tilling the bean, taking out the flush of weeds, and that can be a very effective method. Now, field cultivating works well on some weeds, not quite as well on others. Giant ragweed is one that's not as easy. You need to get ahead of the game. So a good pre-emergence product on giant ragweed will help you make that cultivating work better for you, or working with this change of planting date and then, again, using, the cultivation. So looking at these systems that may work for you. Third strategy that is back to using more herbicides but could include any of the others is layering herbicides. We talk about the group 15s like the duals, the Outlook or Warrant, Zidua, putting some of that material down as a pre and then coming back with your post applications and adding additional material as your post to extend the season of weed control, especially for common water hemp. That, unlike ragweed, common water hemp germinates throughout the growing season, and as long as there's an open canopy out there, it will take advantage of that and come through. So when I said at the beginning of this, it is not simple anymore, it certainly is not. We have weeds that have a different biology, how they grow and develop, when they produce seed. We have this early season versus all season, and then even the control tactics have to be a bit different.
You left one out, though, Lisa, and I never thought I'd come back to it, but a year ago and this last summer I did a little bit. I went out to those spots that drowned it out 2 years in a row, and I actually walked out there and pulled them one by one, walking beans. And I don't want to do the whole field, but I'm back to doing little pockets here and there.
Well, you are adding that very good point, because that's what we've been saying most recently, and Fritz and I kind of joke about this, but farmers aren't laughing at us anymore when we bring up these ideas: cultivation, delay planting, and walking our fields. And we are looking at, right now, we're trying to go back into those spots where we see weeds popping through, the ones that have been missed, the field edges. Go out and get them, and it may take walking those fields with your hoe and pulling them to get them out of there. We want to prevent those from going to seed. We want them to prevent them from adding to the seed bank. And if you look at those small patches, we can't afford to ignore them anymore. They are going to be a problem.
You know what I did after I pulled each one? Okay, there's a couple 100,000 seeds that aren't going to be in my field. That's what kept me going.
That's a very good way to look at it, because it's absolutely true. And usually those spots where those individual weeds come through, maybe some plants didn't, maybe the soybean density isn't as you don't have as many soybeans out there. It was the wet spot. It was the area. So the weed that's growing there tends to be pretty good size, and it's going to produce a lot of seeds. There may be others along the edges that, not as big and robust, but you sure know those spots out there when, wow, it's had every advantage to take over and have, a lot of seed. So thinking about walking those fields, we hope we're not moving into having to walk every acre, but I've also made the joke that my kids now will have the same job that I did when I was there.
And what did I say? What goes around comes around?
Exactly. But we can't laugh about it. I mean, we're going to have to get serious about how we manage these weeds.
Lisa Benkin from the Rochester Regional Extension.
My fourth story in the top 5 ag stories for 2013. We hear a little bit about it in the news, but not a whole lot, but it is a huge deal for farmers, health insurance, and what's been going on with premiums. With me to discuss that is a good friend, Dan Pumper, with Farm Bureau Insurance in Faribault and Farmington, right?
That's right.
Yeah, but Dan, when I sit and visit with farmers, having a cup of coffee, of course you talk about the weather, and you talk about the markets and yields, but you know what always comes up? Health insurance. And it's not a big deal for a farmer that is fortunate enough to have a wife that works off the farm with a full-time job, or he works off the farm too, that he has health insurance provided. But this is a huge deal for real farmers, maybe both of them working on the farm and a couple kids. It is a huge deal.
That's right. There's a lot of change in that market now with the Affordable Health Care Act coming into play, and the changes in this past year are a lot bigger than most people feel. They tell us that only 4% of America is affected by it, but if you're self-employed, a farmer, and your spouse isn't in town and can get access to a group, premiums went way up and the deductibles are up.
Yeah, let's put it in perspective. One farmer I was talking to, it was he, his wife, and 2 teenaged and younger children. And they were paying $20,000 a year. And I don't remember that I asked him what his deductible was, but now for this next year, it was $30,000 a year for $12,000 deductible. And there was only one plan in the state of Minnesota that was offered, and that was a limited plan by Blue Cross. One in the entire state of Minnesota. People don't realize how serious this situation is for self-employed people.
That's right. And then the way they dictated what plans you could get, even if you found another company or with a plan that, depending on your address, they set up who you could get. Like, for instance, Dakota County is with Alina, Rice County's with Mayo. Well, if you go to the clinic, Alina Clinic here in Faribault, you can't use that plan because you have to buy a Mayo plan if you live in Rice County. And then up by the Northfield Hospital there, that's a Mayo hospital, but if you live right next to it, you can only buy an Alina plan. So I think some of the details of this thing, when they got out in the field, they didn't realize what kind of restrictions are on hospitals and doctors and different things. And you know as well as I do, Jerry, people don't like changing their health care. If they have somebody that they're comfortable with, they want to be able to keep that.
So where do we go from here? I was talking to this farmer, one of them, who said, you know what? That is absolutely crazy. I'm going to save my money, self-insure, and hope nothing catastrophic happens. But if there is something catastrophic that happens, and you have assets, whether it's a land, equity in the land, maybe you own property in Faribault and you rent out property, that could be at risk if there's a catastrophic illness, couldn't it?
That's right. Anybody that has assets at risk, it's pretty hard to go without it no matter what the premium is. Everybody will probably agree that the plans are going to get changed in the next year. Nobody knows for sure how or what.
Or how long it's going to take even, right?
That's right. We're anticipating by next year something might change, but if you choose to not take it for this year, you have to realize that your assets are at risk. Just think of all the texting and driving and stuff that goes on today that never went on in the past. You might get hit by somebody that it's not your fault at all. They don't have insurance, and where would you be? Your assets would be to pay for your health care.
I have to think that when the people that put the affordable health care together, I don't think they envisioned that this would happen. I don't think they did it intentionally, but it is what it is now, and we have to figure out how we can best cope with it until hopefully something changes for the better. As we mentioned, we don't know when that might be or what it might look like.
Yeah, no one knows for sure. You're just guessing to decide what that looks like, One of the solutions that we've found is if you have a son or daughter that's over 18 and they're working for 20 hours, if you pay them on a W-2, then you can slide your family over to a group plan.
So it only takes 2 people, a self-employed business person, whether it's a farmer or maybe it's somebody on the main street in some community. If you can pay your son or one other person, just those 2 then can file a group.
Yeah, you need an employee working 20 hours or more per week, paid on a W-2. They have to take coverage on that group, and then you can develop a group. And the pricing on the group is relatively close to what it was last year on the individuals. I can share a personal story with you. My families went from $998 a month to $2,030 a month, and I have 2 kids.
Yeah, because you were a self-employed business person, so you personally have been caught in that too then.
Exactly, yep, and my wife is self-employed too, so it's the same as if we're farming or anything else, or you're self-employed. That's who's in this, and I really think that, that they give us the numbers. They said that 4% of Minnesota is dealing with this, and that's why, as the voice is so small, that's why it's not getting fixed fast. You know, I mean, they talked about doing some different things where they were going to use some of the money that was in surplus to help offset the cost, but who knows if that's ever going to come.
The thing that's frustrating to me, I understand this personally too, pre-existing conditions. Person has health issues through no fault of their own. I understand that probably should have been fixed a long time ago. But Minnesota, that's the beauty of having 50 different states. They try different things. What was it, Minnesota Care or something? That was that special program for those with pre-existing conditions?
That's right. In the past, we had Minnesota Care, so anybody that couldn't get accepted through the general health insurance would go to Minnesota Care, and the price wasn't that much more expensive. Quite honestly, if you pulled back papers from back when they developed this thing, they were pointing at Minnesota at one of the best healthcare systems around. Well, in 3 short years, we've turned to one of the worst. Now, I seen an article the other day said we're in the bottom 5 of states in healthcare because we have such limited amounts of plans to go get.
And with this Minnesota Care, too, I was talking to someone that was on it. The premiums were a little bit higher than if they didn't have these health issues, but not that much. They could still afford it, felt they were getting value. The benefits were very good. They were happy. So looking back, I'm thinking, why didn't the federal government then say, okay, let's go to the other 49 states and follow Minnesota's example that's working very good? Because I understood that the losses then that Minnesota Care had, everybody else in the state paid a small percentage more to help those who were trying to do the right thing. They wanted to buy health insurance. They wanted to do their part, as I mentioned, through no fault of their own. To me, that's kind of how government is supposed to work. You help the people that are trying to help themselves and be responsible.
I don't know anybody who said that the system that we have now is working like they thought it was going to work. And even the people that developed it, I don't know how they would say that it's working like they thought it was going to work. Yeah, more people might be insured, but if you jack up the prices like they have, 50% or 100% more this year, there's going to be working people that decide not to carry it. That's not working. That isn't what we're looking for.
But the key is we have to try and do what we can to protect our assets, protect our businesses until hopefully something changes in the future, and as we mentioned, we don't know when. The other thing that occurred to me, I was talking to one farmer, or this one that said he was just going to self-insure. Well, if something changes, then I can get insurance. Well, there's certain times when you have open enrollment, and what if it's such that, you can't get it then till a year from now? We don't know when you can actually get it, even if it is changed.
The new thing that we're all hoping comes, I don't know, nobody knows what it's going to look like, or what, if you have a plan, will you be grandfathered in? Will there be full medical underwriting on everybody's plan? Who knows what's going to come or what they'll develop?
I just have to say it has to be very tough on those of you that are in the insurance industry that have to talk to customers and try and figure out what you're going to do. It can't be very fun for you or Diane here at the office right now.
That's right. Diane and Sarah have done a really good job on her helping with the healthcare, and it's never an easy story, right? It's never an easy conversation because everybody's is going up, and everybody's is going up a lot.
Well, and even those that are on groups, most of them have to pay a certain percentage or a certain part of it, and they're seeing that the part that employees are having to pay are going up a lot, in addition to the companies that they work for are going up a lot.
That's right. If you're fortunate enough to have a group plan at your work, don't underestimate how big of an advantage that is for you. You might not see it every month when you get your check, or every 2 weeks when you get your check, but if you are getting some kind of health care through your employer, it's a tremendous help compared to what you'd pay out in the market.
Well, thanks, Dan. Maybe by the time we visit with you and the kids at the Rice County Fair next summer, we'll maybe have some of these issues behind us and we've moved on to something for the better.
I hope so. That'd be great.
My fifth story in the top 5 ag stories, well, it was in my top 5 last year, and it's still a hot topic out there. Sometimes not so much in the media, but it sure is when you're visiting with farmers, and that's the buffer law, buffer strips, whatever you want to call it. My go-to person on that keeps me informed is Warren Formal, the executive director of the Minnesota Agriculture Water Resource Center. How's that, Warren? You're an expert now.
Well, it's nice to have been involved in this issue, and I've certainly had a lot of experience and conversations with farmers as this issue was rolled out.
And the key is, most of us that are farming, and I work full-time besides Warren, granted I'm kind of a hobby farmer, but we're so busy in what's going on at the DNR and what's going on at the legislature as they try and clarify it and tweak the law. Most of us just don't have the time or the ability to do that, so we depend on people like you and the Resource Center and others, farm groups, commodity organizations, to decipher everything and let us know what it means to us.
Yeah, and I think one of the main objectives that we've had in recent months is just to make sure that farmers and farmland owners are aware that there have been changes in legislation, actually in each of the last 2 years, and that it won't affect every landowner. but it's important that landowners stay tuned in and understand what changes are happening in the buffer requirements. And one of the key things is to check DNR's website, where they have a map of where these buffers are going to be required.
Before we get to that, Warren, let's just back up. We're kind of in the process of explaining and implementation, and then everything has to be set to go by, when was it, 2018?
So actually, on the public waters side, the deadline to have the buffers established is November 1st, 2017. So we've got about 11 months. And so we've been advising those who have public waters designations on their property to be working with their NRCS and SWCD offices to try to figure out what plan they need to put in place. And most landowners have already had some initial contact if they're affected by the public water side. The public ditches, the buffer requirement kicks in for them on November 1st, 2018. And then one other little wrinkle just to make things even more confusing. If you're using CRP, for example, as your means of complying with these rules, then you actually have an extra year to get the buffer established, but you would have to have made contact with your local office about using that program by next November for public waters and November 1st, 2018 on ditches.
And would this land be eligible then to sign up under the continuous CRP? Because there was some discussion there that maybe that wouldn't work.
Sure. So right now, the best information we have is that, yes, it is eligible. And so I've talked to a lot of landowners over the last few months who have been into their local county FSA and NRCS office and have begun the process to enroll these buffer areas CCRP, or continuous sign-up CRP. The challenge is, and the concern is, that from what I'm hearing from the state offices, there are acreage caps that are coming into play. And so if you're interested in using CCRP, you should, again, be talking to your county office. But where a few months ago we could be pretty confident you could get into those programs, that confidence is going down because of the concern about acreage caps.
At first, when I started to find out about this, it kind of sounded like it was a one-size-fits-all. So let's go first with the public waters. Is there a set, it has to be this many feet, and this is what you have to do? Or is there more flexibility, maybe depending on the need and your current practices?
Well, unfortunately, there is no simple answer for that. The law says that on a public water, the buffer must average 50 feet in width, minimum of 30 feet in width. If you just read that part of the law, it would mean 50 feet on average with a 30-foot minimum. However, there's a caveat in the law that says that a landowner may meet the requirement of the law by using what's called alternative practices. Unfortunately, we really don't have a lot of clarity on what sort of alternative practices or combination of practices the State Board of Water and Soil Resources will deem to be equivalent to a 50-foot buffer. And so that's one of the wrinkles that I think will have to get worked out in, whether it's future legislation or whether Bowser builds it into the program that they're building. As you pointed out, this one of the main concerns that a lot of landowners had early on was this one-size-fits-all approach. The legislature, I think, sought to reduce some of that anxiety by putting in the opportunity to do something other than a buffer, as long as you provided similar water quality benefits. Unfortunately, we still don't know how that's going to be implemented.
What about now the private ditches?
Two different categories. So public ditches, those ditches that were constructed under Minnesota Statute 103E, and most landowners will know if they have a public ditch through their property. The buffer requirement that's going to trigger and become effective on November 1st, 2018, requires a 16.5-foot buffer on those public ditches. Again, those folks should have either been contacted or they should be expect to be contacted fairly soon by their county, so they will know where they need those buffers added. So that the public ditches is one category. Private ditches have been a tremendous source of controversy over the last couple of years because it's been unclear at times whether they're in or out. Do they require a buffer or not? And if they require it, how much of a buffer do they require? In general, the private ditches, there was a political agreement as the legislation was being put together that private ditches would not be covered under this legislation. But the wrinkle that many landowners were unaware of and are rapidly learning is that in some cases, these private ditches are also designated as public waters. And so if you're a landowner with a private ditch that's designated a public water, you may have been concerned thinking, oh, my ditch may need to have a 16.5-foot buffer on it. It's actually 3 times worse than that, because if your private ditch is a public water, has been designated a public water, then you're subject to the 50-foot requirement. Now, again, I've talked to a lot of landowners with private ditches who are exploring the alternative practices provision, hoping that they can do a lesser buffer, perhaps 16.5 feet, provided that there are other features in place that protect water quality. But it's one of those big unknowns.
I have a private ditch in 2 of my farms, and it always has been a private ditch. But what do you do then if all at once Bowser or DNR has come in and said, no, that's a public ditch?
Well, what we've been advising farmers to do is first go in and talk to your local SWCD. They have been designated by the Minnesota DNR as the contact points in each county. So rather than having to deal with hundreds of thousands of landowners, DNR designated the county SWCD as the place to route your concerns. So if you have a private ditch and you go to the DNR's map and it shows up as a public water and you are wanting to raise an issue about that designation, you should go talk to your local SWCD. And it's then your SWCD's role to take those requests or concerns from landowners and bundle them at the county level. They might have 1, they might have 50 or 100, and then they would bring them collectively to Minnesota DNR. So their role, and to be very clear, the SWCD's role is not to tell you whether your concern or whether your request to have a buffer or a public water taken off the map. They are not going to make that decision at all. That's not their role. Their only role is to take the landowner's concerns and deliver it to DNR, and then DNR will take up that issue.
So if I'm going to try and implement some alternative practices, who decides whether the alternative practices are okay?
Well, initially, the law, as I read it, allows the landowner to decide. So it says that the landowner has some latitude to figure out what those alternative practices will look like. But then there is also a provision that suggests that a landowner might ask the local SWCD to come out and review those alternative practices and actually give them a letter stating that their practices comply with the legislation. So a landowner could choose to ask for their approval of that practice. And then ultimately, the State Board of Water and Soil Resources will be putting in place some sort of a process or some protocols for counties to decide what sets of alternative practices pass muster and which ones don't. And that's really the grayest area and one of the greatest concerns that I think a lot of landowners have right now is really not knowing just what Bowser is going to expect.
But the long and short of it is now check those maps and just kind of stay tuned with your farm groups, commodity organizations, or you at the Minnesota Agriculture Water Resource Center as all of this plays out, right?
Absolutely. Stay tuned and expect that there will be continued communication from your county as to where you need buffers. There's also likelihood that the legislature may pick this up again. And then I guess I really want to make sure to point out that throughout this debate, and remember it started with allegations that farmers were not doing things to protect water. And now as we roll forward 1.5 to 2 years, many counties report that the vast majority of these required buffers were already in place. And I think it's important to note this was never about being for or against protecting water resources. It was just about how. And so we've gotten bogged down in these legal definitions and details, but the bottom line is that the vast majority of these resources are already being protected and were even before this debate began.
Warren Formo, Executive Director of the Minnesota Agriculture Water Resource Center.